A few years ago, my older brother passed away. Shortly before his sudden death, he had moved into an off-the-grid cabin in a semi-abandoned logging village deep in the Maine woods. He bought the property from the previous owners for dirt cheap. His death was completely unexpected. He wasn't sick and never complained about his health. He was a cheerful guy who just wanted to live away from civilization. But the circumstances of his death were deeply disturbing. His body was found on a dirt road leading to the village. He was missing his left leg, and his face was frozen in a grotesque grimace of pure terror. The local authorities concluded he was the victim of a brutal bear attack. Even then, a worm of doubt crept into my soul. My brother never stepped foot in those woods without his hunting rifle. Yet no rifle was found near his body. I couldn't logically explain his bizarre death any other way. I buried my brother. As his only remaining relative, I inherited that cheap cabin. On one sunny Sunday, I decided to drive up to the village. The town had no name. It was officially listed in country records as condemned. There were no road signs, so I navigated using coordinates. I arrived around noon. It consisted of crumbling, rotten houses, pathways overgrown with weeds, dead gardens, and leaning fences. But the most overwhelming impression was the absolute crushing silence. There were no birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves. The village consisted of 2 small blocks. The perimeter was enclosed by a massive wooden fence with only one entrance. The block where my brother's house stood was to the left of the gate. I decided to walk around the entire block first, inspecting this strange and gloomy area. Suddenly, I heard a sharp squeak. It sounded exactly like a metal saw scraping against a rusty pipe. The source was an open window in one of the neighboring houses. I saw a freight curtain swaying slightly and realized why the sound was so unnerving. Besides my own footsteps and the rustling dry grass, it was the only sound in this entire place. I got this heavy sensation that someone was watching me from the shadows. After a short walk, I finally gathered the courage to inspect my brother's house. It was a 2-story cabin. On the first floor, right past the entryway, was the kitchen. On the dining table sat a plate of half-eaten roasted potatoes, giving off a savory aroma. I cautiously took a fork and took a small bite. The potatoes were piping hot. The very second I put the fork back down, a sound echoed from the hallway. A small metal ball, about an inch in diameter, bouncing down the wooden stairs from the second floor. It hit every single step before rolling across the floorboards and coming to a stop right under the chair. I pulled the chair back to pick it up, but I didn't find the ball. I inspected the bottom of the chair, but I didn't see the ball this time either. It had completely vanished. I started feeling deeply uneasy. I had absolutely zero desire to go up to the second floor to investigate. I decided that 15 minutes in this village was more than enough for me. I glanced down at my watch to check the time. It was already 1:30. It was impossible that I had been there for an hour and a half, but the hands on the clock showed exactly that time. Suddenly, a deafening stomping and crashing erupted from right above my head. It sounded as if 10 heavy men had simultaneously jumped out of their beds on the second floor. Pure blinding panic seized me. I sprinted out of the house. I threw a quick glance at the spot where I had parked my car. To my absolute horror, it had been moved. It was now parked completely outside the block, in the different part of the village. I was running away from that damn house, but something was already coming down the stairs to greet me. probably exactly the way it had greeted my brother. As I ran past the front of the house, I glanced back at the window and saw it. It had an unnaturally square face. Right in the middle was a tiny nose, and below it a gaping maw. There were no eyes on its head at all. I bolted toward the car like a bullet. As I jumped into the driver's seat, the creature stepped out of the front door. It looked like a deformed humanoid, missing its left arm, but with a grotesquely muscular right arm. This massive arm wasn't growing from the shoulder, but protruding horribly from its shoulder blade. I slammed on a gas pedal and sped past it. I was driving away in a state of absolute shock. After putting some distance between myself and the village, I checked my watch. It was 10 minutes to 4. Time was completely broken. At exact 4 o'clock, I pulled off the dirt road onto the main highway. I pulled over to the shoulder, opened the door, and fell to my knees in the grass, violently sick. I stared back in terror toward the turnoff leading to the village. Ever since that day, I only sleep with the lights on. I put the house up for sale the exact same day, asking for half the price my brother paid. I explicitly wrote that it required major renovations. A buyer appeared, a young pair of newlyweds wanting a secluded honeymoon. The price was so attractive that they gladly agreed. A month after the sale, I received tragic news. The young bride was brutally murdered out there. Her eyes had been completely scratched out, and her husband had lost his mind. The property was immediately seized by the state. Investigators came to my house, but I lied. I answered that I had only been there for a few minutes and knew nothing. Today, that entire area is some kind of restricted military or government facility, completely surrounded by barbed wire fences. People on the internet write that there is a massive magnetic anomaly zone there. On Google Earth satellite maps, that specific spot just shows an endless, dense forest. What is actually going on out there right now, I don't know, and I never want to know. This happened back in the 1990s in a fading, gloomy industrial town in Maine. My parents had gone to work far away in Alaska to make a living, leaving me under the strict care of my grandmother in the cramped, gray apartment building on the bleak outskirts of the city. I had just transitioned into the second grade, making me around 7 years old, while the entire neighborhood crew of kids was at least 5 or 6 years older than me. Because of this massive age gap, and despite my grandmother's fierce prohibitions, I frequently sneaked away to play on the adjacent streets just to escape the loneliness. Pretty soon, I fell in with a rough crowd of older boys. I cannot say we were actual friends. I simply had no other choice, and I lacked the brains at that age to realize that they were merely using me for their own amusement. Their manipulation scheme was incredibly simple. They would constantly take me on a dare, proposing various bets and games that it was physically impossible for the 7-year-old to win. Afterwards, they would aggressively remind me that for a real man, a bet is a matter of absolute honor. I had to pay off these manufactured debts with my lunch money, candy, or rare comic books. They played their roles perfectly, keeping me in a perpetual state of artificial debt. I don't quite remember the exact day they lured me to the ruins of an old colonial stone mansion deep in the dense woods. We spent an hour exploring the crumbling, moss-covered brick walls and climbing through shattered foundations. The atmosphere among the dark trees was heavy, and the ruined structure looked like a decaying jaw rising from the earth. The ultimate test to clear my entire debt was laid out before me. I had to descend a narrow, crumbling flight of stone stairs leading down into the earth, open a heavy, rotten wooden door, and step into the absolute darkness of the subterranean cellar, pulling the door shut behind me. That was it. If I succeeded, my dad would be entirely forgiven, and no one would ever question my bravery again. But if I failed, my dad would instantly double. A couple of the older boys began to nudge me, whispering that it was a total piece of cake. I vividly remember catching a predatory, hungry look in their eyes at that moment. They knew exactly how much I was terrified of the dark, and they were savoring my fear. I slowly walked down the damp stone steps, my boots crunching on loose gravel. Inside my chest, a desperate hope lingered that the ancient door would be rusted shut, ending the nightmare right there. But as I reached out, the heavy iron bolt slid back with an effortless, oily click. I froze, holding my breath, listening intently to the void beyond. From the pitch-black space behind the wood, someone or something let out a soft, long sigh of pure anticipation. It was the kind of deep breath a person takes in the morning when they are looking forward to something wonderful from the brand new day. I spun around in panic. My so-called companions were standing at the top of the stairs, their faces twisted into ugly, mocking grins. A sudden burning urge flamed up inside me to smash those smirks off their faces. I turned back, pulled the iron handle, and threw the heavy door wide open. The floor past the threshold was entirely covered in a thick layer of fine white sand, which looked deeply unnatural for an underground cellar. Stepping over the threshold, I pulled the rotten door closed. The moment it touched the frame, it slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the heavy bolt slid into place from the outside. Instantly, a loud, mocking explosion of laughter erupted from the other side of the wood. I panicked, throwing my weight against the door, pounding my fist against the thick planks, weeping and begging them to let me out. From the outside, they just kept laughing, shouting through the cracks that I had to pay a massive monthly tribute in candy and give them half of my prized toy collection if I ever wanted to see the sun again. I was terrified enough to agree to all of their cruel demands, but before I could scream a response, a sudden wave of freezing, icy breath blasted against my bare neck from the depth of the cellar. A violent, uncontrollable shudder ranged my entire body. As my eyes frantically adjusted to the absolute pitch-black darkness, I realized I wasn't alone. Deep in the shadows, on the white sand, a tall, monstrous silhouette began to manifest. It was an impossible creature, grotesquely elongated, with thin, multi-jointed limbs and two large, milky white, hollow eyes that shifted rhythmically in the dark, staring directly into my soul. Pure, suffocating horror paralyzed me. My legs gave out and I collapsed onto my knees, burying my face against the rough wood of the door. The dark cellar felt like a trap closing in, and I felt as though the door was made of the cardboard, wishing I could just smash my head right through it to escape, but I had absolutely no physical strength left to stand up. I just sat there in the white sand, feebly thumping my skull against the boards. Suddenly, something incredibly sharp and cold dragged slowly down my spine. The sound of my heavy jacket fabric ripping apart echoed like a thunderclap in the confined space, leaving a freezing, slimy trail against my skin. A set of rough, leathery fingers crept up toward my throat. They wrapped around my neck, squeezing with agonizing force. From the outside, one of the boys shouted a question, asking what I was doing. I desperately tried to scream that I would give them everything I owned, but the entity's grip was so tight that only a pathetic, choked whimper escaped my lips. And just as the darkness was about to completely swallow my consciousness, the outside lock suddenly clicked. The door flew open and I tumbled backward out onto the stone steps, sobbing hysterically. My older boy stood over me, pointing and roaring with laughter at my tears. I don't remember exactly what cruel words they hurled at me, but that was the exact moment I experienced a blinding, consuming hatred for the first time in my life. I wanted those 3 bullies to burn alive. I wiped the tears from my eyes, stood up, and looked them dead in the face. I told them that I would give them all my comic books, my entire toy collection, and my grandfather's prized vintage military binoculars if they had the guts to step into the cellar themselves and prove it was empty. Their arrogant expressions shifted into greedy smirks. One of them spat on the ground and said, "Watch this, you little punk. We'll show you there is nothing to be scared of." The 3 of them stepped over the threshold onto the white sand. The heavy wooden door creaked on its rusty hinges and slowly swung shut behind them with a soft click. I stood on the stone steps, my heart racing, waiting for them to start pounding on the wood or laughing. But what followed was an immediate muffled shriek of absolute blood-curdling regret from inside the cellar. It was cut off instantly, followed by a wet, heavy thud. Then, a dead, eternal silence enveloped the ruins. I stood there for a long time as the sun went down, but not a single sound ever came from behind the door again. When darkness completely covered the woods, I calmly turned around and walked home. In a little girl's bedroom, there was an old wardrobe that had a large mirror attached to the inside of the door. This girl was a fan of tickling her own nerves before bed, so sometimes she would open this wardrobe in the dead of the night and look at her reflection in the dark. One time when she got bored, she did it again. She was surprised by an interesting and creepy effect that appeared this time. Thanks to a strange play of moonlight and shadow, her reflection in the mirror appeared to have empty, black eye sockets and a huge, unnaturally wide mouth. The reflection looked very realistic, almost 3-dimensional, and mimicked her movements. After admiring this creepy sight for a minute, the girl closed the door and went to the bathroom. But on the way, she remembered something, and it made her instantly turn on the bright light in the bathroom, lock herself inside, and wake up her parents and half the neighbors with her hysterical scream. The thing was, during rearranging the day before, her father had removed and taken the mirror out of the wardrobe. This happened a couple of years ago. At the time, I was living with my parents in a sprawling, old 3-bedroom apartment in a historic building. I always loved animals, but for some reason, they never lasted long in our house. They either died or ran away for unexplained reasons. There were many times when a pet would get severely sick, and in a miserable state, we would give it away to a different home. And literally, a week later, in a new house, animal would miraculously revive, become completely healthy, and live for many years. At first, I blamed it all on my own irresponsibility and inability to care for them. But one day, when I got a dog, I looked at it from a completely different perspective. My dog was constantly staring at something. It would sit in the middle of the room and stare into empty corners as if it saw something we didn't see. Sometimes it would bark aggressively at empty doorways and growl, baring its teeth. I tried to logically explain it to myself by thinking that it probably just heard the noise of the neighbors behind the old walls. But one night, I was lying in my bed. The apartment was submerged in silence. Suddenly, I heard the thick power cables from my laptop scattered across the floor start moving loudly. It sounded exactly like someone heavy had caught their feet in them and was dragging them across the hardwood floor. I thought it was my dad getting up for water. I called out to him into the dark, but nobody answered me. Then I called for my mom. Nothing. My only answer was the sound of someone's breathing coming from right out in the hallway. Deep, raspy breathing that did not sound human whatsoever. Shivers ran down my spine. I yelled, "Hey, stop messing around," hoping it was just a prank. No answer followed. I forced myself to get up and walked out into the dark hallway to see who was there. There was no one. I carefully peeked into my parents' room. They were fast asleep. At that exact moment, my dog started owling in the living room. It was a long, pitiful owl full of pure fear. And that is when I started to feel truly terrified. A couple of weeks later, the situation escalated. My parents went away for the weekend, and I was left to sleep at home absolutely alone. I watched a movie, turned off the lights everywhere, and went to bed. Barely had I settled under the blanket when a sound echoed. Someone knocked clearly 3 times on the wooden door of the bathroom. Probably any person knows exactly how a knock sounds on every specific door in their own house. I froze. I stopped breathing. A dead, oppressive silence fell over the apartment. I started calming myself down, thinking I just imagined it. But then came 3 more loud, slow knocks. This time on the front door. I jumped out of bed. I was shaking. I grabbed my phone and immediately called my older brother, Mark, who lived just a 10-minute walk away from me. I started hysterically explaining to him that someone was inside the apartment. He told me not to panic and to calm down. He advised me to walk up to the door and look through the peephole. I did exactly that. I walked down the long hallway toward the front door, turning off the lights in every single room along the way to feel safe. But the second I reached the front door, the lights in the entire apartment violently shut off. The power was cut. I was completely paralyzed by shock in the darkness. I pressed my face against the door and looked through the peephole. I could clearly see that the lights in the hallway outside were still on. The problem was only inside my apartment. I started crying into the phone from fear and begged Mark to come to me. He said, "I'm leaving right now. Lock yourself in the..." But he couldn't even finish his last sentence before my phone simply shut off. The screen went black. The battery couldn't possibly be dead because it had been on the charger all day. I was left in suffocating darkness. I gathered my courage and with a determined but trembling step walked to the pantry for candles. I lit a candle, took it in my hand, and walked back to my room, whispering prayers for all of this to stop. And then I heard footsteps inside the apartment, right in the hallway. At first, they were slow, heavy steps, and then someone bolted and literally ran into my room. The sound of the footsteps stopped right in front of me in the gloom. From that visceral fear, I started having severe gag reflexes. I rushed into the bathroom and I literally threw up from the sheer stress. And then I heard a sharp ring from the intercom. I was incredibly surprised because I knew that if there was no power in the apartment, the intercom shouldn't be working either. I ran out into the hallway. Barely had I reached the door when suddenly a loud knock echoed again. I froze, expecting the worst, but then I instantly heard Mark's voice behind the door. Sighing with massive relief, I clicked the lock and threw the door open. At that exact moment, like a snap of the finger, the lights turned back on the entire apartment, and immediately I heard the chime of my phone turning itself back on in my bedroom. Mark stood on the threshold. He had also seen the lights suddenly turn on by themselves, and now he was looking at my face, which was as pale as a chalk. We sat in the kitchen that entire night without closing our eyes. After that incident, the entity stopped hiding. Everyone in the household began to constantly hear someone heavy walking around the apartment. Dishes would shatter on their own, wires would fly through the air. Relationships in the family became incredibly tense. We were always fighting because of that oppressive feeling. Soon, we made the decision to move out immediately. We sold the apartment, new tenants moved in. Literally a month later, these new tenants called up early in the morning. They tearfully asked if we had ever noticed anything unusual in that apartment. We shuddered and answered negatively, hiding the truth. Then, with a trembling voice, they told us what happened. During the night, they heard the horrific scream and crying of their infant daughter. They ran into the nursery in the panic, and what they saw made them freeze in absolute horror. Their baby wasn't lying in the crib. The baby was suspended in the air 3 feet off the floor. The little girl was choking as if someone large and invisible was tightly holding her by the throat. As soon as the adults entered the room and screamed, the invisible hand sharply released its grip. The infant fell to the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. The little girl suffered a concussion that night. What that creature was and how those people are living now, I don't know. I hung up the phone and never contacted them again. But every single day, I thank God that we moved out of that cursed apartment in time.